Before we go further, we need to introduce a slightly more advanced programming technique. Objects are a great feature in PHP that let a programmer combine data and functions and package them up in a nice way that makes them easy to manage and reuse. Note that a full lesson in object-oriented programming is beyond the scope of this tutorial, but we'll teach you everything you need to know to use it with PHP. If you'd like to learn more on your own, Google object-oriented programming. Note also that the object system we discuss in this tutorial is the one built into PHP version 5 or higher. Version 4 did have objects, but they were more limited. You should be using PHP 5 or higher for these examples. Let's have a look at the object.php sample file. You'll notice that the first line includes a file called mydate.php, but let's not look at that yet. Instead, we'll start with the mydate documentation. So load up mydate.html in your web browser. This file was generated by a tool called PHP Documenter. It creates a quick reference of how the mydate object works without you having to read through the source code yourself. So even if the mydate.php source code was a jumbled, unreadable mess, you could still use the functionality by following the documentation. Switching back to object.php, we can see how this object is being used. The first line uses the new command to create a mydate object with what's called the default parameters. When you call new, it returns a variable containing the object. Going back to the documentation, have a look at the function called construct. This special function is called whenever you create an object. In this case, you'll notice the $date variable is enclosed in square brackets. They indicate that the parameter is optional. So $D1 is created without specifying a date. $D2 and $D3, on the other hand, are created with specific dates passed upon creation. Now that the objects are created, we can use their related functions to retrieve the data. Looking over at the documentation again shows us 4 different get functions. We call a function on an object by using the dash triangle bracket operator. Notice that it looks a bit like an arrow. This syntax is borrowed from the C++ programming language. Other languages often just use a period. This first get function returns the date in a familiar format. The second outputs just the date as a short numeric value. The third shows us raw internal Unix timestamp representations, which happens to be the number of seconds since January 1st, 1970. We can also see the functions to return the original date string, as well as a function that returns all representations at once, separated by commas. All of the complexity in code to manage the input and output of these date formats is hidden inside of the mydate object, so we don't have to worry about reading through the source code when we're working on object.php. Using objects in this way makes designing large, complicated web applications much easier and less error-prone. In the next chapter, we'll learn to create our own PHP objects.